Hey everybody, this is Steve Cizik again, managing attorney with the Harris Law Firm Tax Division. Um, Finalizing our three-part series on ERC audits. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Part one, we talked about what ERCs are and necessarily how they came into being. Part two, we talked about the big two as far as qualifications for ERCs and then ERC mills and how the IRS has reacted to essentially rampant fraud in the ERC sector. And part three, in my mind, the most relevant part, now that we have some context, is the ERC audit and how we deal with those. That's what my team and I deal with. And certainly if you found yourself in a position where you have an ERC audit and you have either no knowledge as to how to address it, your CPA is no longer able or around to assist, or most of the ones that are finding themselves to me are these errant filings to the ERC mills, where they were never approved or vetted by a CPA. And certainly a CPA doesn't want to touch that with a 60-foot pole. And so then it's a function of having to go back and sort of reverse engineer how these numbers were generated and try to prove to the IRS that they're qualified. Or if they're not qualified, that, there are portions that would fall under the various different allowances for these so that the impact is not as significant on a business in these particular instances. So getting into ERC auditing, the top reasons that I found for ERC audits, we just go back to those big two: lack of proof, gross profits drop, gross receipts drop. If the company was operating and it was operating at full tilt, we do have a lot of companies that did very well during COVID. Contractors who could get into buildings that were shut down, any sort of delivery service during that time was doing very well. We have sometimes IT professionals where they could work remotely, so they're working more, setting up remote, type of thing. So, just because it was COVID doesn't mean you didn't do better, during the periods in question. So you really have to dig into that. And unfortunately, if you had somebody else doing this for you and they were less ethical, or they were just not, they didn't care to actually review it before they filed this so they could get their money, you could find yourself with an audit and not necessarily qualifying under that particular provision. Lack of the governmental order. Let's say you don't qualify, you knew it, but there was a governmental order that shut down your ability to operate your server or whatever. We would just need a copy of the order. If the thing was filed without the order, then the government's going to assume, IRS is going to assume that it doesn't exist. And it's the onus is on the taxpayer to provide that. And so that's actually an easier audit if you have the government order. But as indicated in my previous webinar on item 2, sometimes those government orders are conflicting. Sometimes government orders are not encompassing the timeframes we're talking about. And a lot of the times the government orders aren't, talking about your business operation. And so just because it was a government order and it was happening in your area does not mean it necessarily affected your operation. And there's partial suspensions and things like that. So, the government order is a very nuanced one. It can be very straightforward, or it could be very subjective. And that's really when you want to engage with an attorney who knows what they're talking about, and hopefully one who's got a little bit of, jab in their step with respect to negotiation, because convincing an audit agent one way or the other could be, the difference between hundreds of thousands of dollars. So worth taking the time to make sure you're well represented in that instance. Double dipping PPP. I harped on this one in the previous webinar. You cannot claim PPP for your employees' wages and pay the employees and the taxes with government money and then go back and say you need a credit back of that government money. That is theft. So that is one of those things that is tantamount to taking money out of the government's pocket, and they do not like that. Although it happens all the time, it is known as tax fraud. and you do not want to be someone who is culpable of tax fraud. So if you do have PPP and you have ERC, let's hope there's a CPA that's allocating those particular government funding vehicles appropriately. If the CPA is gone and you get audited, that's when you do engage somebody to represent and then potentially reverse engineer those numbers to prove to the IRS that there is a qualified, ERC there and there is a qualified PPP. Employee threshold error. The aggregation rule is a unique one, and it's actually one that I've seen twice, come up, which is because it's such a sort of a nuanced thing. I was surprised, but apparently the IRS is focusing on these. This is if you've got multiple companies, but they're under one management structure. So you've got, I want to think of like a brewery, all right, and it's a brewery that's nationwide, but each one of them is held under independent LLC, and so those independent LLCs are all filing their various different ERC claims because they were a restaurant / brewery and they weren't working, and so clearly they had some qualifications there under the big two, and they've got one CPA who's filing independent ERC claims for all these different LLCs with different EINs. IRS could come back and say, wait a second, even though they're all a brewery, they're all named, Big Boy Brewery. And just because you've got, different operational structures for those and you all have DBAs or whatever it is for LLCs, this one CPA was filing for all of them. And there's one management control group above all of those particular LLCs. And so they're looking active employees, and you can only apply for employees if you're above the threshold that weren't actually working during those periods in question. So we're going to remove all those and we're going to take our money back. And so that's an argument that is hard to I guess fight. Would be the tough one because it is so nuanced, because they can just decide that they're going to aggregate these particular companies under a management group. And then it's just a function of then going through individual employee, wages, W-2s, payroll records are a good thing. In this particular case, I was able to confirm that the employees were not full-time in the amount. So there were certainly a number that were full-time, but there's certainly a bunch that weren't. And so then they couldn't get aggregated into the amount of employees for this particular entity. And we snuck in below the number for 2021. We lost the argument for 2020, but the numbers are such that the 2020 number ERC amount was much less than the bigger one in 2021. So there's a lot of kind of, I want to say, forensic auditing that can come along with the aggregation rule. If you do find yourself, in the crosshairs of aggregation rule, please do engage with a tax attorney. You're not going to probably do this on your own. Your CPA is going to have probably good enough information, but may not have the, just the legal wherewithal to argue with respect to that particular item. Poor calculations. That one's easy. I mean, if and this will happen even if it's a legitimate CPA, if they don't have good numbers, sort of crap in, crap out, right? So if they're not, if they're claiming 26,000 for every employee, for 2021, but those employees didn't actually meet the threshold for the amount of time that was worked, or they didn't meet the threshold for the amount of time or amount of money that they made, then that's going to be audited. So you've got your cashier, she's not making enough, during those particular quarters to qualify for the full amount of the ERC audit and ERC credit. And so they're going to come back and they're going to want to look at all that documentation again. And if your filer did it correctly, they actually submit a packet with it. Here's the government order, here's the packet of the payroll, it's all there. Those guys aren't getting audited. It's the ones that just filed the 941Xs and then just, let God sort it out. those are the ones that are going to get reviewed and audited. And the IRS's antennas are up for the type of employees and the amount of credits that are being claimed. How do we deal with it? So like I said, you can do the special withdraw program if you you watch this and say, hey, I am just concerned that I don't qualify. I'm going to get a huge audit and it's going to be, significant expense for me. You can go on and file, for essentially a withdrawal, and you can keep 20% of what they sent you. So you got to come up with the other 80. It's penalty free. Go ahead and file it. Be done with it. If you can sustain that financially, that's always advisable, assuming that you don't qualify. So you're getting a free pass. If you can take advantage of it, do it before the end of the year. They probably will not extend that further after the end of the year. You can always repay the ERC credit before the audit hits. Let's assume that you don't get the withdrawal in. You're watching this later this year and you're like, oh boy, I'm in the doldrums here. Go ahead and take the money and send it back. And just refile your original 941s. So basically it's a 941X on top of a 941X, and just pull back that credit, send the money back. You probably would want to call a tax practitioner, or you could call a tax attorney, because I would want to connect with the IRS and make sure that those credits were properly applied. So that's sort of those things are both staying in front of it, identifying that there was an error, and knowing that the man is coming, so to speak, and trying to prevent that eventual fallout. Hoping they don't show up is not a good idea. I did have a client, their bookkeeper was like, well, they sent us a check, and it cleared, so we're probably fine. And I, politely mentioned to her that is absolutely not fine. The IRS can always disgorge, funds that have been submitted to you if they were submitted in error or fraudulently. It's as if someone stole my social security number and they filed a tax return and they got a $10,000 refund. Well, just because that $10,000 cash doesn't mean that guy didn't commit tax fraud, right? So just because the IRS sent the money, excuse me, does not mean that it was correct. IRS is incorrect all the time, and then they'll figure it out and they'll penalize you because you didn't identify the issue, right? And so it's not fair, but that's just the way that they work, and we have to understand that so we can, proactively address it when we get into audit. And that leads me, to my last bullet there. We want to proactively respond to that audit. You don't want to not respond. You don't want to, stomp your feet and say this isn't fair. You want to respond to that audit agent, and you want to make sure that they understand in good faith. You want to address the issue, and you weren't aware of it. If this was an ERC mail or something like that. Best ways to address that ERC audit are to identify and review all source documentation. This is easy stuff, hopefully. Obviously depends on how your books are run, but ideally you'll have a payroll company, a CPA, or even maybe the ERC mill call these people when they came through to draw their information for filing those returns. That makes things a lot easier. You want to cross-reference your 941X with your actual filed returns, because that's going to show the difference between the two, and you can determine whether the numbers actually are valid based upon your payroll summaries. You want to understand what was completed on your behalf, and why the IRS is saying that is incorrect. I've had so many clients say, look, they just filed this. I don't know what they did. I got the money. I'm good at building houses, Steve. I'm not good at books. Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm sure you're very good at building houses, but the IRS doesn't care. And guess what? You're not going to be building houses if they come in and take $1 million out of your account. And so at that point, you need to, as a business owner, advocate for yourself. You need to go in there and say, okay, what was filed for me and why was it filed? And if you simply don't understand it, then get a representative, get an attorney, get a CPA, get a bookkeeper. Let's get in there and reverse engineer it so that we can find out what this company did in order to claim these credits. And a lot of the times they actually, unbeknownst to them, the ERC mill actually filed it kind of right. not because they knew what they were doing. The company fell within the broad scope of the law, and we just had to find it, right? So until we know why and how they filed it, we can't defend it. And so we have to get that documentation. We have to understand what was done. And then we have to go, then we go to battle saying, no, yeah, we get it. There weren't gross receipts here, but look at this government order. Or, hey, this isn't an aggregate rule. These are all, fractional employees that were never actually, full time. These type of things was like, okay, we identified what they claimed and why they did it. Now let's try to justify it. But we can't justify it until we know it. So, that for me has been the biggest and most interesting part of these audits is digging into it and seeing, aha, they do qualify. Hallelujah. Let's prove to them that they did. Let everybody keep their money and move on. Address the audit position directly. This one is a little bit different because there is in audits, a lot of times we're looking to define the argument. And you get a business audit and they're looking into your sales tax expenses, for example, and I'll redirect towards, hey, look, that's coming from a different account. You guys are, barking up the wrong tree. So, I'm basically kind of creating the argument for myself. With these ones, you are best to just say, why did you reject it? And this is why you're wrong in that rejection, as opposed to kind of leading to a different avenue. And so we don't want to get in the weeds, with, well, this ERC mill did it, and I don't really know, and I'm not a sophisticated party, and it's their fault, So, if you start pointing fingers, they don't care. At the end of the day, the onus is on the taxpayer. And if you start pointing your fingers and say, well, I need to get a hold of these people, give me an extension, they won't return my calls. Eventually, the IRS is just going to get impatient with that, and they're going to assess you, and you've never had a chance to defend yourself. And so, just if they're gone, if the ERC mill is not calling you back, if your CPA has gone to the Caymans, whatever it is, you need to go ahead and step forward and address it, and not try to point fingers and then bury your head in the sand, because that's just going to end badly for you. A full denial of an ERC audit or an ERC claim may not be valid. Sometimes there's nuances. So maybe you didn't qualify for the first quarter of 2020, but you qualified for the first quarter of 2021. And we talked about before, if you qualify for one quarter, then that automatically gets you the next quarter. So now you went from 6 quarters of having an audit rejection to only 4. And that can be the difference between hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the business. And so just because you don't qualify for some of those audit periods doesn't mean you're going to just get completely eliminated on all. Now the IRS will say that. It's like, no, you don't qualify for any. Prove to me which ones you do. But it's not like it's the end of the world. If you're like, oh, geez, I didn't qualify for, second quarter 2021, this entire $1 million refund check has to go back to them. No, let's delineate which ones qualify and why, and let's see if we can save you some money in the deal. And then obviously try to prevent the penalization, because we've proven that you did, in fact, good faith, have some qualifying factors. You can always appeal an assessment. Reasonable cause, lack of sophistication. That's like a penalty abatement type philosophy. That's sort of your Alamo. When it comes to ERC claims, you try to win on the substantive basis, as far as, do I meet code, meet code provision, qualify for credit. If it's like, yeah, I was close, and I was under a reasonable impression that I qualified for this because of all of these factors, and I acted as a reasonably prudent business person. Given that I'm not sophisticated in taxes, I build houses, I don't do books. Those are arguments that we can make. It can be reduced. Most likely, you're not going to eliminate an audit assessment in that particular situation, but just because, and I say this honestly, just because you were duped and you found after listening to these webinars that you didn't qualify and you're in the middle of an audit, it's not the end of the world. You can potentially get that reduced with the facts that are to your advantage. And we can prove that you're not. I mean, if you're a tax attorney and I'm taking these ERCs, I don't really have a reasonable basis to say that I didn't know what was going on. But a lot of people out there who were just getting these calls from these very pushy people saying that they knew what was going on, or unsophisticated parties just saying, yeah, I need the money. I'd be happy to fill out these forms. You do have a basis for reduction, and it's worth pursuing depending on the amounts that we're talking about. And that brings us to the end of our webinar series. So in summary, the ERC was a good plan with poor execution. I think the government had the right idea. Hey, let's go ahead and promote the sustaining employees through nationwide events. I think it was well intentioned. Unfortunately, just the execution was terrible. And in any government situation, when the execution is terrible, there's people that take advantage of it, and that's what led to these ERC mills, rampant fraud. Over $1 billion, of current ERC claims that are potentially fraudulent. So we're going to see the audits from these for the next 4 or 5 years, I'm sure, and I'll be dealing with all comers, right? So we're prepared for it. Ultimately the IRS doesn't care, whose fault it was, right? They have money that they sent out that shouldn't have been sent out in their mind. And so it's the businesses and the businesses owners' obligation to advocate for themselves, like I said, respond intelligently, pragmatically, engage with the representative, engage with a tax attorney, engage with CPA, pull the documentation, and review it to make sure that it qualifies. Hopefully you understand it. If you don't understand it, engage somebody to explain it to you in terms that you do understand, and do all that proactively. If you do get an IRS agent showing up with an audit, make sure you take the time to understand it and don't react negatively or aggressively. React intelligently and pragmatically, so that you can go to and into that audit with a position of power. Going into an audit in a position of fear or chest pounding or arm waving is not going to advance the ball, and it's going to put you and your business in a really tough spot. So that's my general and overall sort of review of IRS negotiation. I've written a book on it. So if you are, have a hard time sleeping and you really are curious about IRS negotiation, on the website is my book in e-format, and you can actually get that on Amazon and on Kindle as well. It's called Unlocking the Code by Steve Cizik. So feel free to take a look at that. Feel free to give me a call. If you have any questions about ERC, you have any questions about tax collections, lien subordination, tax audit, family law taxation issues, estate taxation issues. We do most of it. We do most, if not all of it. So look us up. Feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. Happy to discuss any of the topics that we've talked about in this 3-part webinar. Thanks again for making it through. Hopefully, if you've seen this, it provided you some insight, at least generally, so that you can go ahead and, like I said, act pragmatically, advocate on your own behalf, and get out there and make sure that you're most protected if this ERC thing comes creeping up on you. Thanks, guys. You guys take care.